Hello, everyone. I'm Tim Woods here to give the horticulture outlook for Kentucky. Appreciate a chance to visit with you here today. Wanted to start out by giving a big picture view to point out that we had very strong local produce markets here in Kentucky. In spite of the COVID and surging imports, lots of disruptions in the market. But overall in Kentucky, we saw really good yields and a very strong overall production this year. Our general market conditions, while being pressed somewhat by some of the national and global conditions, were still very strong for our wholesale and for our produce auctions particularly. And in spite of these disruptions, especially in the direct markets, very strong growth in farm markets, CSA, and agritourism. Very strong home consumer spending, strong construction, home improvement conditions all led to also very strong markets for both our nursery and greenhouse space. And in sum, where we're going to land here is we're going to anticipate here in 2020 record horticulture sales for Kentucky this year, passing $160 million. The big picture in our global trade continues to show big plays from Central America, Mexico in particular, in terms of growing imports into the US, putting pressure on our markets. And a lot of our horticulture enterprises, of course, still very heavily dependent on labor, face continual rising costs on, particularly for our H2A workers. Those costs are going up very quickly, and especially for our larger scale commercial horticulture enterprises that depend on this labor, those costs are very real. And if it wasn't for the really strong demand conditions, I think our folks would really find themselves being pressed. This is going to continue to be an issue looking forward into the next few years. This shows just the continued growth in terms of the share of fresh produce, particularly that is coming into the United States. And here, especially over the last decade, this volume has continued to grow and putting pressure on opportunities for our growers here domestically. But in Kentucky, here we've just seen long, steady growth for our sales, farm gate cash receipts for both fruits and vegetables. And 2020 was certainly a record year in spite of all the disruptions in the marketplace that we'll talk about here. And when you add in our nursery cash receipts, we're going to certainly eclipse $160 million, a record level for our horticulture sales in Kentucky for 2020. As we look across the different market channels for produce particularly, Kentucky is very diversified in the kinds of market channels, but still a lot of emphasis on the direct-to-consumer channels, the local products to local markets. And all of those direct market channels saw substantial growth in spite of having to adapt to some of the limitations around COVID. Farmers markets, agritourism especially, CSA opportunities continuing to expand, more farmers involved in CSA, more shareholder patrons that are involved trying CSA for the first time. But the other really strong growth area has been our produce auctions, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. And so the growth comes in spite of really difficult circumstances that have faced the restaurant, direct to retail, farm to school programs. Those have continued to be relatively minor players in our market channels, but we certainly have seen some producers that have been significantly adversely impacted by those. In the farmers market space, a lot of disruption as the COVID program hit and lots of adjustments were being made by retailers. Farmers markets had to scramble to be able to convey that they were also an essential business early in the spring when all this was being hit. And while the way those markets function certainly changed, vendor numbers were down, especially some of our senior vendors chose not to participate in these markets. In spite of that, the demand for produce, particularly the prices that folks were able to see, and new patrons coming to the market, even through drive-up sales, curbside service, led to a very strong market here. And in spite of fewer vendors on the shoulders of the produce sales, we'll see an increase in sales here for 2020. Probably the biggest story in terms of produce growth has been around our produce auctions. We now have 6 auctions that are active, over 700 producers that sell through these auctions here currently. Fairview over near Hopkinsville, our largest produce auction, has seen significant growth. And a big part of it for all the auctions here in 2020 during this COVID space was order buying, where orders are put in for produce on the auction by remote buyers. As you might expect during this COVID period, that was an important mechanism that buyers were using to source product from these auctions, up substantially in terms of how many people were using that. Very strong supply was met with much higher gross sales moving through these market channels. Very low cost aggregation facilities that allows accommodation to all different size vendors and all different size buyers. That was a perfect fit, actually, in spite of having to manage some of the difficulties associated with some of the food safety and COVID social distancing challenges. Some of the auctions were even moving into some delivery activity services that they were taking from those auctions. So we certainly had some challenges, and traditionally this is an older picture, but these auctions attract big crowds. And so having to manage the social distances and providing signage and direction and sort of protocols for how the auctions were going to function were really important things to get put in place for these auctions all across Kentucky and really all across the country where these auctions are serving. But this shows just the change in year-over-year sales that took place at Fairview, our largest produce auction, and every month a substantial increase over what had been previously a record year sales in 2019, and especially for September, October, and the fall crops, where pumpkins, mums, and some of these other fall crops were showing up in great force and contributing substantial increases over what had been seen previously. And so a lot of our vegetables and ornamental and fall products really took a big boost there in the fall. The local marketing, our Kentucky Proud program, continues to be a big supporter in this marketing and promotion. Now over 10,000 food businesses and markets that are participating in the Kentucky Proud labeling and branding. Programs like the Restaurant Rewards Buy Local programs certainly saw a big step back, although it wasn't quite as completely dead stop as you might think. We still saw maybe as much as 60 to 70%, as there was some recovery later in the year with participation in those programs. We look forward to seeing those programs pick up again as we get onto the other side of this COVID market, and know that that's an important market channel for our producers. Just to close up, a few comments on the nursery and greenhouse sales. National sales trends, as we've heard from folks that do some of the national market analysis, point to, again, significant increases in sales, particularly at the retail level. Garden centers and on-farm retail spaces that are selling nursery products, floriculture products, all did really well. And together in Kentucky will come to approximately $110 million here in terms of aggregated sales across wholesale and retail sectors. As always, we keep a close eye on things like the new housing starts. This time last year, I was putting this slide up here, and we were looking early into 2020 and a strong trajectory of growth as housing starts were continuing to expand. But of course, as we hit this period of the COVID, you can see the huge drop off that took place and a lot of hand wringing, of course, in the nursery space. But a surprisingly very quick recovery. And as you can see here later in the year, housing starts up relatively high, well above what had been seen during the previous 4 or 5 years or so. So short crash, strong recovery, and this has led to a strong, particularly second half of the year, demand for our nursery crops. So if you look ahead to 2021, we'll continue to see expanding wholesale markets. I think we'll see especially our produce auctions continuing to play an important role in expanding our produce activity. We hope to see recovering restaurant and institutional market channels. That will be especially dependent on the COVID outcomes, farm to school, farm to restaurant. In the big picture, keeping an eye on Mexico and Central America and the national market trends for produce will be still important looking ahead to the next 3 to 5 years. On the other side of this market disruption, keeping an eye on labor costs and the relative competitiveness of our produce operations in this increasingly competitive market. I think we'll continue to see good markets for our nursery products, largely driven by continued low interest rates and strong consumer spending. And the outlook is actually then fairly bright for our markets related to horticulture. And look forward to pulling together these summary results as we bring this market season to a close.